is everyone tonight? Yeah. So I'm going to talk about 4 works of mine, and I'm going to go into detail with them. And I would like to keep this informal as well. So if you have any questions while I'm talking, please feel free to engage in that on that level. Yes? Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction, Godard. And yes, I'm very honored to be here tonight and to share with you my practice. I'm very much looking forward to tomorrow as a guest tutor and meeting some artists that are here and to get more informed on what they're doing. It's always a nice exchange to have these relationships. So as Hajar said, I'm working in the fields of, or let's say, my background is in theater, dance, and the visual arts. So you see an amalgamation of these different disciplines within my practice. I'm going to start with the work, Allegory of the Painted Woman. This is my largest scale work to date. I started it in 2012, and I was going to different museums, galleries, palazzos, private collections, private libraries, and collecting works of art from Renaissance to the start of modernism, and looking at the woman's body as the main protagonist within these works. And I was interested in what is the gestural language of the body within these works. What is it saying? And I was interested in going through history to look to see if this gesture was repeated through the different genres of different eras of painting and sculpture, or if it was the same. So it was a deep research and an investigation into that and looking at these archetypes and forms. So for example, you would really be able to see a certain archetype and that gesture is repeated again and again and again and again throughout history. And you still see these gestures embedded in Western history, Western notions. If you look in the open Instagram, you're going to still see some of these gestures. The image that you see behind me here is, this is from the studio in Rome. So I was in Rome and I collected over 1,000 works. And what I was doing in the studio was looking and categorizing the body in space and time. So looking at basically how to start building this choreography. And then after my time in Rome, I made a film with live nude models at the Art Academy in Rome. And then when I came back to Amsterdam, I was really dissecting the choreography that I made there, and I started to break it down. And I broke it down into one sequence of movement, and it's 48 poses. And these 48 poses are repeated again and again and again and again and again. When I was at home in Amsterdam, I started to basically think about how I'm decontextualizing the body from its period of history and when it was actually manifested. And so in that sense, I brought it back to the line, I brought it back to my own hand as a means of trying to understand what was happening there. And then as a means to kind of decontextualize it even more from the emotional and historical level, I started to think about it more on its abstraction. So what is the body doing? What are kind of the mechanics of it? Really looking at how it was being shaped in space. So I was working with Dr. Anne Hutchinson-Guest. She was the main pupil of Le Bon, and Le Bon was the first person to create a systematic notation for movement. At that time, Dr. Anne Hutchinson-Guest, this was, when did we do this? 2013? She was 95 when I met her, and actually she most recently died last year. But what was really fascinating about this meeting was her main pupil was the one that translated the score, the choreography, this one sequence of movement that I was talking about. And she hadn't seen it before, and she was just reading it. So she was reading this like you would read a book. And so she's looking at it and she's saying, okay, so if my head would be a little tilted back here, and then my shoulders up here, and then I would be reaching with my right arm. And then, as she's kind of reading it, she's starting to embody it. And then she starts to question, okay, well then what would be the emotion? How would I feel if I'm actually in this? So it was the reverse of how I was actually seeing these poses. So it was interesting in a way of thinking about different embodiments by taking it back and taking it into the abstraction. So it's just another means for me to think about how I was choreographing this work. Simultaneously, I was creating a sound score. So I was using the sound more as a directorial aspect of how to move in space. The piece, the performance is two dancers and it's four musicians. The sound is high notes, which are delineated for one dancer, and then lower notes, which are designated for the other dancer. The high notes are played by two clarinet musicians, and the lower notes are played by a euphonium and a tuba player. The first time that this is actually an image that I'm showing right now from the Rijksmuseum. This was the third time that it was performed in 2015. For me, I'm very much thinking about who is embodying this work. And a main theme or thread in my work is thinking about the subjectivity of the performer that is performing this work. I'll go into more depth and detail of how I actually do that. But it's a lot of doing and reflecting. There's very much a personal aspect in how the performer is engaging with the work. And it's a very personal one or intimate one that the dancer and I share together. So there's a lot of, in a sense, thinking about, of course, looking at it historically. What did this gesture represent? But then how do you embody it? How do you see it? How do you feel it when you fill this volume? What is it doing to you? And so in that sense, it's very important for me that through the times or the period that I create this work through my career, I'm very much interested in getting a very diverse range of genders, of ages, of races, to look into different readings of how to embody this work and how to bring one's subjectivity into it. Contextually, of where I position the work, I'm always thinking about the politics of those spaces and how the work meets those politics in collections. So here you have the Rijksmuseum, and it was very important for me that a dancer that was Surinamese Dutch was performing this work and embodying it. So here you have, this is Hervé Torborg, who is a Surinamese Dutch dancer. And then here you have Marica Moelli, who has been with me since 2015 performing this work. She's an Italian dancer, and she's really speaking or connecting to the genealogy of the work, seeing that the archive of this work is coming from Italian art history. Within my works, as I said earlier, kind of the way in which I engage with the politics of these collections or these spaces is I'm always creating publications in relationship to them. So for this particular publication for the Rijksmuseum that I created, I wanted to speak towards the polemics of this space. And then at 2015, the museum was still marketing the Golden Age and not really questioning why the Golden Age was the Golden Age and who the Golden Age was for. So one of the ways in which I did that, or kind of questioning these spaces, was it was performed in the Gallery of Honors. So you see in this image, you see the Night Watch behind Hervé. And before you enter into the Gallery of Honors, you have the Great Wall, which is a huge stained glass window. And the stained glass window is, as you see, these are two examples of men, and it either has their names underneath their feet, or it'll be their position in society. And then out of all of those wall of men, you have these four white women who are allegories of different periods of architecture. And as you see, they have no names underneath their feet. It's just these patterns of leaves. So again, it's this idea, as a woman can't actually take that position in society, but she can represent what that is. So there's very much a dichotomy within that. And also when you enter into the Gallery of Honors, you have these rooms, and above the room there'll be an arch. And in that arch, it will have two famous men from that period of history, where it'll focus on either, let's say, etching or painting, like a very specific medium. And then there'll be a woman that is holding the actual form. So again, another allegory. And then the way in which I did that was I work with, through these publications, I worked with a graphic designer named Dawn Young Lee, and she graphically translated that space And you can see a little bit of that here. On the back side is I asked the activist, researcher, writer, poet, Surinamese, Dutch writer Simone Zweke to write a poem in response to this work and the space and the polemics of that space, which you see there. And then below that you see is this text, which is a conversation between myself and two of the dancers, Marika and Reve, and talking about, having a discussion, a conversation about how do you feel this? What is the energy that you bring into it? Where are the points where it's difficult for you? Where is it easy? And you kind of can see throughout that conversation the different types of embodiment of this work. Before that, it was performed at the Young Unique Academy, where I was a resident. This was in 2015, and here you see Truus Bronkhorst, who was a very prolific figure during the postmodernist dance scene in the Netherlands. At this time, she was 62 years old. Marika was 22 years old, so you have this 40-year age difference between the two of them. And it was very interesting because the way in which how Truus brought to the work, her life experience and her knowledge was a very different embodiment, and also having physical restrictions with her body. So you see this different type of embodiment that gives you another type of reading and how you associate with it. Because for me, this is an important part of that work is how are you, what are you imprinting on the bodies that you're seeing before you? How are you interpreting this history that you've been taught? And then what are you actually feeling of the energies of the performers that are there in front of you and transmitting that energy? So there's this friction between what you think you know and what you feel. After that, it was performed in 2018 at the Latvian National Museum of Art as part of the Riga Biennale. Here again, you see Marika. This time, Roshanak performed it, who's a Dutch-Iranian dancer. And you can see that they're wearing different garments. This was the first time that I started to collaborate with Alexis van Jolen, who is a designer. And she used her signature method where she's inking up the different pieces of fabric, and then she's layering the fabric on top of each other, and then she puts it through the press. So for me, this method and this way of the imprinting of the clothing very much speaks to the performance and the imprinting of bodies in time and the fragmentation of that history and how we choose to read that history or not read that. I was at that time also doing a commission for the Riga Biennale, and I was doing deep research into their collection, looking specifically at the Soviet doctrine era. I was interested in how the women of that time were being depicted in the paintings, and to see kind of the contrast of that embodiment with the archive of allegory of the painted woman. And I was also asking the museum, what is the percentage of men artists versus women artists in their collection. And they didn't know, so they did a whole study for me to look through the different periods of their collection to see. And in the end, we found roughly through the periods of time, even in the Soviet doctrine, that it was 25% women, 75% men, which in comparison with most collections, which can only be 1% if we're lucky, 25% is quite high. So that just gives you kind of an idea of how much progress we still need to make. The next time it was performed was in Beaux-Arts in Brussels as part of Performatique. And then here you see Nafisa Baba, who is a British-based dancer. Again, you see Elisa van Jolen's clothing. This performance was in the context of Bernard van Olie's exhibition at the Beaux-Arts. This was an exhibition that they were working on for 5 years in collaboration with the Met and with the Louvre, and they put in millions into this. And I was quite puzzled. I was wondering why do this huge exhibition on Bernard van Orly right after Van Loon? to understand that the Flemish government was indeed putting multi-millions into kind of perpetuating this narrative. And then, of course, I was questioning, being a woman contemporary artist and being kind of, in a sense, a band-aid to this program and understanding how I was being instrumentalized within this whole structure. The publication that I made for this work was, I was working with a historian in Brussels, and I was wondering because, of course, there were quite a few women artists of the time of Bernard van Orly, but of course the Guild were the ones that were putting the women into history, right? Of course, they weren't writing them in the books, and if you're not written in ink, you're not existing in history, or your presence is not written through time and people do not know about you. But of course, the imprint of what you did is there, even though people might not know your name. So she gave me the names of 5 different women that were commonly named in the archive. And then I took these 5 women and made them into these fictitious characters. And the proposition that, of course, maybe they could be artists of that time. And I gave them these signatures, and then I embossed these signatures on the paper that you see here, and then wrote them and wrote a text, in a sense, questioning that, of course, their names aren't in ink. And then the rare case that they were buried in the pages with no guild or system to record, confirm, or validate their work as artists. Once they ceased to exist, their societal memory did as well. They were the daughters, the sisters, the wives who painted. And of course, this is a proposition to demystify the male contemporaries of these women that our Western cultural institutions continue to prop up, to change the course of historical negligence by revealing these and other marginalized artists, to acknowledge the lack of systems put in place to record and thereby seek to correct such gender bias and to identify a space of opportunity within our institutions for the representation and support of all artists. So you can kind of see how the work, of course, the performance stays the same, but then in the context, it's bringing up of course, the social political issues that are still present today, but looking at that also through its historical presence within these spaces. Another way, of course, as Godard mentioned, within a certain research, I'm also, when I go back into this work, Allegory of the Painted Woman, I'm always finding something new. So, for example, back when I was doing it again in 2018, I returned to the imagery again. And I started to play on pieces of fabric, of folding the fabric, ruching the fabric, and then putting a silk screen on top, going through it, and then opening up that fabric to see these different cuts, and then the image becomes fragmented. And actually, where I feel the work comes through is through the ghost prints, which was, of course, the clearing of the screens, where you see the positive and negative space of that screen, but also this fragmentation of the bodies as well. And you can see this echoing as well with Elise's work, right, on the fabric of the clothing. And of course, no two prints are the same, so they're always different. And again, for me, this very much echoes the work and the fragmentation of history. Before I move on to the next work, does anyone have any questions? At the moment, I feel that the fabric works are not resolved yet, but the prints are, I'm presenting them as on the wall. Yeah. They're different sizes, but they're about like that size. Yeah. Yeah. Or they can go like. And they're always black and white. They're always black and white. Well, because I just used one screen. I mean, it's something that indeed I could investigate more in terms of if there were different colors with it, but I wanted to be just kind of very honest with the material and just have one screen, one image, and also this idea kind of the reproduction of the image, right? That's constantly in reproduction, and use that idea of just black and white with it. Are they part of the performance? Like, are they part of the performance? Do you like to perform photography, or is it really something that you present separately? I present it separate. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay. If it comes, yeah, please. So I just want, because we're at a certain point where we're talking about like the female images, or like the female gestures. Soviet paintings and classical paintings. I was wondering, because you said, of course, you talked about the percentage, but I was thinking, is there also a difference in this? Because I assume in classical is very much like obedience or like cars. I assume. Is there a difference from also? Of course, there is a difference, and that you have, of course, the woman as the worker, yeah, in different different working settings, whether that's industrial or secretarial work. Then you have the domestic worker as well. So you have her in the domestic settings as well, and so of course, it was a very interesting to have conversations with women artists there who were making work during the Soviet doctrine period of time, and how they saw their work, and kind of in a sense, maybe they didn't, or they would never label it as feminist. And I think also the word feminism, or the conversations around feminism, is seen as as a Western idea or notion. But if I would look at the way that they were kind of, some of their paintings, the way that they were expressing themselves through it, you could see, I personally, but maybe that's also a projection, could see there were kind of hidden kind of codes or ways of expressing frustrations through the kind of depiction, or yeah, the application on the canvas or the painting, or the paper, excuse me. Yes, and so this is what I was interested in, was looking at that. How much freedom did they actually have? And in one of my conversations with an older woman artist, she was like, I was so tired of how the men were depicting women artists. But then when I was asking her if she saw herself as a feminist, she said, I'm not a feminist. So it's more nuanced there in relationship to this discourse, and then of course to how they position themselves in their environment, and in their work. Isn't it becomes super absurd? And not absurd, maybe it's a bit of a negative word, but it's like a very specific situation where each propaganda artist, say, if I may say so, you develop this kind of like feminist discourse without that acknowledging it as well. And it becomes really layered. But in a lot of the conversations too that I had, this of course comes up. But then the main aspect is like, who had the power to make decisions? At the end of the day, who had the power to make the decisions? So even though the women are being depicted in these power situations, or maybe, yeah, that were being emancipated, let's say, through the act of kind of working in these more male-dominated spaces that in the West would be considered, they're still having to go home and take care of the entire family as well. And who's making more of these political decisions for the country. Yeah, I mean, it's a larger conversation. Anti-feminism not only like anti-feminism, but it really plays also against them, no? Like there's this level of freedom that you can do yourself, and then you're doing a lot of, you're doing labor architecture, you're doing labor life, then you just come home and you do labor again, and the question is, where is this, wow. Yeah. a lot of gaslighting, so to speak. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next work. This is very much a successor to Allegory of the Painted Woman. It's titled Conditions of an Ideal. And this was started with this book by Diana Watts titled The Renaissance of the Greek Ideal that she made in 1914. And this is a book that I found while I was researching with Allegory of the Painted Woman. And an important thing I should probably know is my works take on a larger research phase. And then from that research phase, I bring it into the studio where I'm embodying the different things, or the archive, I like to call it. My archive, I'm embodying it, making different bodily explorations, different vocal explorations, and then I move it into a collaborative process where I'm collaborating with different people, whether that's musicians, dancers, graphic designers, fashion designers, smell artists. I'm missing some people in there, but yes, for me, collaboration, I believe, is the future. And it's where that I believe it's imperative that we have to collaborate with one another and to find solutions. So this work, Conditions of an Ideal, Diana Watts was part of a leader of the physical culture movement. What is the physical culture movement? Basically, it's exercise. This was the start of kind of exercise world that we know today in the Western world. Diana Watts is a wealthy woman living in London, and she was visiting constantly the British Museum. And she was very much fascinated by Greek antiquity and very romanticized this period of history. And she was interested in what is this ancient Greek sculpture and what's happening, what's the movement that is happening before the static posture and what is happening after it. So she was also putting it into her body and exploring this. And from that study, she created this series of calisthenic exercises. I always have to laugh because she believed that through these calisthenic exercises, you could create the perfect body. You could create the ideal body, the Greek form that she sees and has studied, which is super problematic, and as we know, is not the case, which I'll explain a little bit later. Also, during this same time, you had Isadora Duncan. In Western dance, Isadora Duncan is kind of seen as the grandmother of modern dance. She too was romanticizing in this period of Greek antiquity. She took off her corset like Diana Watts. She had this Greco-Roman flowy dress that she was moving and kind of using that as inspiration to create her dance form. Mind you, before this, of course, it's kind of coming off of this Victorian age of how they whitewashed Greek antiquity. Which is kind of how, in a sense, that period of time is taught up until recent periods where people are questioning the whitewashing of this history, and so, but you can see these women and how they're very much in this period of romanticization of it. 10 years later, you had Dora Menzler in Germany. She was part of the free body movement. Are any of you aware of the free body movement in Germany? No, okay. So this was basically the free body movement. They believed kind of trying to think about freeing the constraints of the form, particularly Dora of the woman's body, how to kind of free that. So they would go out into nature and they would be naked and moving. And she made these exercises for women. It's called Exercises in Relaxation for Women. So as a woman, you could buy this book and you could basically do these exercises with her. 10 years later, you have the fascist regime that was appropriating the physical culture movement of Diana Watts and the free body movement of Dora Menzler. Here, this image that you see is Hitler's League of German Girls. But you also had Mussolini and Stalin that also had these group of women that were doing these exercises or these movements in unison and in symmetry. Now, why are they doing that? The whole idea is kind of saying, here, look at us strong women. We are strong, we're united, we are the ones that are going to produce the male leaders of this fascist world. So, and of course, you had Hitler, who was obsessed with Greek antiquity and used kind of Discobolos as this epitome or this of the Aryan race. However, if you talk with a discus thrower, if you talk with a restorer, they will tell you that this posture is impossible to achieve. You cannot actually physically do this. It's not possible. And also during that time, the sculptors were creating fictitious muscles. So they were creating muscles on the body that didn't exist. So here we are, kind of still to today, idolizing these bodies and these forms, forms that we are never able to obtain ourselves. So you see how kind of problematic this is and how it's still embedded in our Western society. I was a resident at Delphina Foundation. This was 2016 when I made this work, and I was commissioned by Block Universe to make this work in the British Museum in the Parthenon Gallery. So are we all aware of the contentious space of the British Museum? It's not our heads, yes. Right? So, of course, the good old Brits, they stole the pediment sculptures and the frieze, about over 50% of that from Athens. And of course, everything that's in the British Museum is stolen and pilfered. And the Greek government has been asking for so long to have these works back. But, the museum uses this very lame excuse of, that if they give these back, then, they don't know if they'll actually be able to be taken care of, this thing, because in actuality, if they give one thing back, they have to give everything back to who they stole from. For me, what was important was with this performance was to assemble a group of dancers that was very diverse in how we looked at this, this very polemic white Eurocentric idea of the body and the conditions of that. So I was using Dora Mensler's exercises, I was using Diana Watts's exercises and looking at the failure of them. And also looking at of course, the sculptures and the images in the actual space and questioning the embodiment of those things and the failure of them in relationship to these kind of very problematic ideas of beauty and idealism. So again, in age, it was a difference. The youngest dancer was 12, the oldest dancer was 62. And then Tanya, being a disabled dancer, also had a different embodiment of this work as well, also being very used to having to adapt and modify for spaces. So when I was there, I created a film, and this film is one shot through the space. And I was, of course, I wanted to speak towards the polemics of this space. So I went to Athens and I went to the Acropolis Museum, and I photographed the fragments that were still there. So in the Acropolis Museum, it's very beautiful. You have what was stolen from them is in plaster, and what they have there is in the fragments. So you can see the loss and the violence of that loss there in that space. And the difference, of course, in the British Museum is it's inverted, right? So you as the subject are at the center and everything's pointing into you. Whereas in the actual Acropolis, it's pointing out towards the city. And it's basically a kind of the story of democracy. But as we know, that is also kind of problematic in relationship to that period of time, because it wasn't about equality for everybody. And so I'm also in the choreography questioning the subject and the collective. So how do you still keep your autonomy within the collective body? So I implement a lot of different democratic tools within the choreography. So with the film, I photographed these fragments, and of course it's hard to see on the projection, but they're rasterized, the image is rasterized with holes, and is placed on top of the film. So sometimes you can see the image and the background of the dancer moving in the space. Sometimes the fragment of the pediment sculpture or the frieze is sitting on top of it. So again, this idea of speaking towards what we see and what we do not see, and the fragmentation of this history. I'm going to show you a trailer of that before I move on to the next work. And I forgot to show you Allegory of the Painted Woman, so I'll show you that right after.
In the river.
No. So, but the other girlfriend who survived has seen the crocodile.
And now I'll show you Allegory of the Painted.
Katarina. Salome. Judita. Andromeda.
Thank you. Okay, does anyone have any questions about condition and ideal before I move on to the next work?
Maybe I'm wondering because if you have allegory of a woman, it's something you can change according to the place for performance. But this is like too site specific, or can you do a performance?
This one I haven't performed elsewhere. It was very site specific. If I would make this work again, I would have to really think about the site of it, but also who's performing this work, if it's still the same performers. How do we meet this work now, today? What has changed? So, I mean, it would be much more process based in relationship to that. Of course, still kind of use some of the similar developments of research that I described earlier within the actual choreographies. But the positioning of it in space would change quite a bit. Yes. Yeah.
So the very museum they didn't acquire the work.
No. No, and this is the first performance ever in that space. I mean, they had orchestras there, like playing kind of more classical thing, but this was the first contemporary piece, and then yeah, no, no. I mean, that was the thing too. Kind of for me, also, it's in questioning these spaces, like critiquing these spaces. Of course, these institutions want it, like let's say Bazaar or Rights, but then they don't actually want to engage in the actual dialogue with that. So it's kind of like, "Oh, okay, we're just gonna put that, and then we're gonna like that, yeah.
It's a one-way conversation.
Yeah, and I'm, kind of, this is back in 2016, and a lot of kind of the experiences of working with such institutions informed the way that now I work with institutions today. And certain kind of ethical protocols that I have in relationship to my team and how we're in that space. And that's a big part of my work is the ethical practice and making sure, of course, fighting for fair wages, but also fair conditions, because there's a lot of exploitation of performance within art institutions, because performance has become so trendy in these years. But most institutions don't have the actual infrastructure to put on performances with care and attention. They still treat performance as an object in space. They're not really considering the labor of bodies in the space. And that's actually, I will address that in this next work of mine, which it's Krackner Boogie Swerves on Jumping to 2019. This is a work that I made right before the pandemic hit. And this was it was an invitation by the curator Vincent van Velsen to return to my graduation of my master's in 2000, which was 2007. So it was interesting, kind of 12 years later, to think about how do I return to a work that is older? How do I return it as myself today? And what do I want to say with that in relationship to where my practice is at that moment? And so I decided to kind of follow still on this line of looking at the notion of breaking norms, breaking constructs, breaking systematic oppression, and what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? And using glass as a metaphor to do that. Because glass is amorphous, it's always changing, it's neither liquid or solid. And like the human body, it's extremely fragile, but extraordinarily strong, depending on how you hit it and break it. So it was, of course, I was looking or using the exhibition space as the process space of making. The work is divided into three parts, prelude and act one and act two. The image that you see right now is the prelude. So when it was the opening of the exhibition, and of course people saw this pristine installation of glass and concrete, which I'll show you in a second. And I came in unannounced and I broke this glass 3 times, but the breaking of glass it's a very violent sound. It almost sounds like a gunshot. So it really startled people. And so I broke it 3 times and then I left. So in a sense, kind of the introduction of what is to come. The installation is, for these particular elements, a reference to Lino Bombardi. Lino Bombardi was a Italian Brazilian architect, and she made these pieces, these elements that went within the building that she designed. She also designed these elements for the Sao Paulo Art Museum. And the paintings sit on top of the glass, or they're in the glass. And so for me, this is also in a way referencing notions of transparency, so the lack of that kind of history or just having the form of the glass. And the idea of what is actually transparent, or we think of glass as being this transparent thing, but in actuality, for many people, it is not. And also how glass is a reflective thing as well. So kind of in a sense, playing with these ideas of transparency and reflection. The glass all was different types of glass. This, of course, that you see here is laminated glass. It's safety glass, so that's on most buildings. You'll have that on your car windshield, right? It's what will protect you. It's not going to break like, say, this glass will, right? If I drop this glass, yeah, it's like, yeah. If I drop that, it's gonna like break into hundreds of pieces. And then of course you have single glass, which you see here, which if it breaks into shards. It's a dangerous type of glass. And all the glass had different frequencies, sound frequencies. So I was working with different physicists at the University of Amsterdam to kind of look at the different sound waves and frequencies of these particular shapes and sizes of the glass. So as you see here, this acted as like a xylophone, right? And you would hit it. So that comes into, I'll explain how the glass was played and the frequencies. This here, the garments that you see here were designed by Elisa Van Jolen again, and she was looking at this idea of what constitutes femininity and masculinity in streetwear, and also looking at as well with transparency in relationship to that and the clothing. And here you see an overview of the actual space. So Act 1 was, and as I mentioned before, the exhibition space was the process space. So you could see the development each day within the space. This was presented in tent in Rotterdam. And you could see what we were working on. And then the last day I called the sketch, which was a culmination of those sessions. Act 1 was with a percussionist you see here, Lauren, and a singer and a sound artist. So the percussionist was playing the glass, and you see there's a contact mic there. And that contact mic is picking up the vibrations of the glass and is going through that cable and into the sound artist's machine, who the sound artist is sampling live these beats and rhythms and creating a score live in space and time. You also see these 2 circular things up there. Those are sound exciters. And when sound exciters are applied to a surface, that surface becomes the speaker. So the glass was, of course, a performer in its own right in that space, but it was the thing that was creating the sound and then pushing the sound out into space as well. And then the singer, Pink Oculus, was also using the vibrations of the glass in relationship to the vibrations of her voice and her sound, and playing on those 2. Her voice, of course, was also connected to the sound artist's machine, who was sampling live and playing. So the 3 of them are really playing between each other. The other kind of bigger round thing that you see on that's a bass shaker. And bass shakers are, gamers use them. They put them under the chairs, or they'll be in an IMAX theater under your chair. It's basically like you feel the bass and the vibration. You feel your body in it. And actually, one of those bigger elements that you saw of concrete and glass, those are around over 100 kilo. And the bass was so strong that it moved the whole entire element in space. So you can imagine what these bass sounds are doing to this 100-kilo mass, and then what that is actually doing to our own bodies, right? And that's why people love kind of going to the club, because it's like you feel it becomes a part of your body. And so as you can see Lauren here kind of playing these different glasses, playing on the bass shaker and seeing the different vibrations of that. And the audience, of course, is reflected back in the glass as well. And then in Act 2, I was working with 6 dancers that come from different dance genres, different dance languages, from hip hop, break, house, West African tap, ballet, contemporary. And I was interested in not how to appropriate each other's dance languages, but how do we create a collective dance language within the subjective dance languages. As I mentioned before, that's very much a thread in my work, thinking about how you keep your subjectivity within the collective. And there's a lot of, in this sense, the work, as I mentioned before, kind of democratic tools within the choreography. So how I can give them space still to bring their self forward. So in the structure of this work, there's also space for improvisation to happen. So there's always these elements of research that are constantly happening within it. And then, of course, with that, also looking at how to break, and this is also a thread in my work, as you've been hearing, how to break these gender codes within these dance genres. And then playing with the vibrations of the glass in relationship to the vibrations of the body, the singular body, the collective body. And then really playing again, as I said before, kind of how glass is very fragile, and playing with this notion of vulnerability within the body, of fragility and strength, and kind of the breaking points of those two. And then I worked with Jamacia, the dancer that you see here, putting on the tap shoes. Tap is one of the dance knowledges that she has, but she has a plethora of other dance backgrounds. And so I worked with her on this solo because she was in the most recent years, she was going to West Africa and tracing her ancestral background and looking at the West African dance. So we worked on this solo of her moving from a very like simple tap step into a West African step. And in doing that, she broke the glass. And glass is it's very much about energy. So there would be times in which she was not centered with this solo and rehearsal. The glass would not break. So it really took a lot of her concentration and power to kind of channel that energy down and into the glass to break it. And then, of course, here you see the boss, Fiona, with the crampons on, and the whole entire group kind of lifts her up, and she comes down on the glass and breaks all of this glass. And then, of course, kind of looking at after this idea of breaking, what is that doing to the body, and thinking about empathy in relationship to that. And one of the techniques that I use within the work and the choreography is therapeutic techniques, but here specifically thinking about kinesthetic empathy. So kind of when one body is breaking or doing the breaking, and how are the other bodies empathetically responding to that and kinesthetically. So this work, I will, because I feel it was also so many, particularly the sound was an experiment, and I'm very much interested in exploring that. So I'll be making this work at KW Kunstwerk in Berlin, and we've been in production with it already, and I'll be going there in December and January for a couple months with a new team, and really exploring the relationship of sound and the glass elements into the body, and working with a Berlin-based team. So before I finish with the last word, does anyone have any questions about this one? Okay. Yeah?
I have a question kind of relates maybe back to the first work that you showed, because then it was interesting to see that in all bodybuilders, women's bodies, it's very classical music, you know? I mean, like, I was because because of course I thought it was interesting to see how females repeat these like female poses. Then on the other hand, like what was the selection? You choose quite like of course the music like the first being back to what we think of classical paintings, I suppose. Then they were also performed, I guess, which is also very male dominant. Um, not society, but like it was very classical music is also mostly male dominated. So I was also wondering how you think about music maybe back then, and how you choose those instruments and also the sound notes, and how you maybe now on a further stage there's also clearly that it becomes maybe less about reenacting poses, but also more thinking on a personal emotional level or something like that. Did you also change in music or?
Yeah, it,
Feels very, there's a difference there.
yeah, there is a difference. I mean, the choices, the choice that I made for the sound for Allegory, the Painted Woman, of course, with the brass instrument, the reason why I chose the wind instrument was to include the breath of the body. That was very important to me. And the way that they play sound, of course, you saw with the trailer, those are only 2 sections out of 9 sections of sound. So it's really not classical at all in how they play. It's a very technical piece. It requires a lot of breath control and timing, precision of timing. So these are all professional, they all play in orchestras, musicians that I've worked with. The sound, of course, is when they start to increase, to go very fast in a section, it's like you start to feel that the limitations of their body. And then, of course, you see the limitations of the body kind of with the dancers. And so this, for me, it was very important to have the connection of the breath of the dancers and the breath of the musicians, and how they were connecting in that way. And for me, it was important to have this to have more of a human created sound and not an electronic sound, and something that was live. So it really plays on this instrument. It plays on that your idea of classical music, the classical body, and of course within these spaces where it eschews it, because it's really, as I said before, it makes you question your impressions or idea of this, and then what are you actually receiving?
Sorry, the breath of the dancers is not enough. You really need the musicians.
Well, you don't hear the breath of the dancers. I mean, the dancers are all, of course, they know how to control that, so they're not like this. I mean, you see the exertion of their bodies, but with the breath, you see the actual musicians, like, you see them kind of trying to keep up with the pace, or you see them kind of trying to sustain the note and what happens there. So, yes, for me, it was important, kind of the breath of sound and the body of sound, that the body creates the sound.
Yeah, I just asked you because once also I had a student who wrote down a whole choreography starting from a breathing process and the movement, and that was really the center of everything that followed and of everything that questioned.
Mm.
No,
I was thinking also these last things again, that you put the sound as something outside of the body, which makes me wonder why.
The sound outside the body, what do you mean?
Yeah, also okay, the sound of breaking the glass. If it's the sound of breaking glass that you hear, it's not really incorporated in a way by the body.
Sorry, I don't understand your question.
I mean, I guess the well, I mean, I know in the first piece, the sound comes from the instruments, and now the sound also comes from the broken glass.
Or you use the person that does the drumming on the glass, and okay, that can initiate somebody who uses the voice, but also there, the starting point is outside you.
I wouldn't say that it's outside of the body. The body is initiating it. It's a relationship between the two. It's not, you need the body to make the sound. So without that, the sound would not be created. So the percussionist is creating the sound. The sound artist is then using that to create another score that you hear, but then that score is being put out through the glass. So it's a dynamic and synergy between the body and, in this case, with Cracking Boogie Swerve, with the body. And in my most recent work, it's all the voice. So it's just the voice, and it's the layering of the sound artist is only using the voice and layering that and composing that, which I will get into now.
Maybe just a very short question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, you did it in 10, now you will do it in KASKlezing. Will you will it only be active, or will it only be there to perform? You also have something like an opening hours, for example, it's just one performance, or it will be present as an installation as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, and I'm going to be, I'm positioning or touring this work in 23 and other places. So the idea is to kind of, and that's something I'm exploring, is the broken glass in the space and the sound elements with that, to kind of, in a sense, not be necessarily just a trace of that performance, but kind of be kind of active or still performing in a sense. So that's something I'm still kind of questioning, is its presence outside of the performance space, and how that can be an installation in its own right. Yeah. I mean, you could see a tent, the kind of progression through the 2 months and how it changed, and the kind of, yeah, how it went, how it had its different phases. And then you could see these different transitions of this installation.
So also at 10, when we're not really there, it's not really leftovers, but the reason of the performance was there, like you saw the glass plates, you saw the broken plates, it was still there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Rock to Joel, Stack of Ash. This is my most recent work that I made within the context of the Prix de Rome 21 last year. And of course, this comes born out of being, deep in the lockdown and being disturbed by the gaslighting and the denial of loss that we were all experiencing. And I was wondering, of course, why is that, and where does this actually come from? And I believe too, we're in a very deep state of grieving right now. Grieving so many things, and it's not only just the loss of so many lives, but also the loss of futures, the loss of opportunities, the loss of the planet. I mean, I'm sure you can all speak towards that. Everybody is experiencing some form of loss or another right now. And I think, kind of this lack of collective spaces to acknowledge this loss and this grief are very problematic. And I was wondering, of course, why is that? Why do we not have these collective spaces? And I started to look into the notion of lamentation and lamenting, not just as a means of mourning, but also as a means of protest. And of course, from a feminist perspective. And I traced it back to Greek antiquity, ancient Greece. And of course, Anne Carson's book, The Gendering of Sound, was very instrumental for me in my research in finding that. That, of course, women were in charge of birth and death during this period. And with the lamenting was an art form in itself. It had its own panatomical musical score. You had many female women lament poets, and the kind of the way that it would run would be from, singing these poems into inaudible sounds, into screaming, into wailing, into clawing at the face and ripping off the clothes, and then back into more of a choreographed movement. And this would not be just one instance, right? Or one day. This would go on for weeks, months. And you can imagine that sound and that cacophony of sound in the streets, that they really had a presence in the city. And of course, this threatens the political men in power. And specifically, you had Solomon in 600 BC, and he wanted to outlaw lamenting. So how did he do that? Well, he created a binary of sound frequencies. So anything higher pitched was considered unreasonable, uncontrolled, animalistic, woman. Anything that was lower pitched was good, reasoned, controlled, man. So this uncontrollable sound was a disruption to the city. It was a disruption to democracy itself. And so here you have this silencing and othering of the voice, which is the pillar of patriarchy, but it's an oppressive tactic tool that is also used in white supremacy and classism. And it's something that is still used till this day. And here you see you have the images behind me of how did they do that, right? So of course you can outlaw that, but you need it to become reaffirmed. So how do you do that? You do that through literature. So you had Homer, right? Homer was the main one who did it, but you also had Socrates, Aristotle, and the way that they depicted women. So you had Homer's Odyssey, right? And the Furies. So the idea of a woman's voice, if that he heard the Furies, he would die, it would kill you. So that idea that a woman's voice is something to be feared, it's something that will destroy you. And then we've got Echo there, right? So you had Zeus, the creep that he was like hanging out with the nymphs down below. And then Hera, his wife, the goddess above, she was, threatened by Echo. So what did she do? She took away Echo's ability to respond, right? So what Echo would do is she could only respond to what was spoken to her, hence the word echo today. She ended up with narcissism, the narcissist. And then, of course, you always have this depiction of women in relationship to animals. So you have here the Fury again, or the siren. And the siren is always a hybrid of a woman's body and a bird. Also during this time, from Egyptian period up to the Roman era, they believed that women had two mouths, our speaking mouth and our vulva. Here you have Hannah Lepard from the 1970s, the picture in the left corner. And then, of course, you have the apotropic genitalia. So these are just a few examples from my research. And the apotropic genitalia there of Sheila Nigig in Ireland, the opening up of the vulva. And you see these apotropic genitalia in different cultures throughout the world. And this idea that these forms of, that they were warding off evil, the exposing and the opening up of the vulva is warding off the evil. And then, of course, you see that above in the illustration of the devil. When the devil sees the hairy pussy, he just gets scared and runs away. And then here in the Flemish painting down below, you have the women exposing themselves. This is the depiction of the Persian War, and they're basically trying to shame the men back into war. And then we have here the hybrid, the kind of the mouth up by kind of in relationship to the vulva is a depiction of Imbe. And Imbe was a Greek mythology character She was also known as Bao Bao, which is the Greek onomatopoeia of a dog's bark. And what she was an older woman, and she would like lift up her skirt and she'd go, and she would just laugh and show her genitalia as this way of kind of diffusing and deflecting situations and scaring off people. And then you have, of course, it's still used in protests today, right? This is one example here. One of the most recent examples you have is a woman was one of the Black Lives Matter protests, and it was in Portland. And she was naked and she was on the asphalt and she had her legs spread open, and in front of her there was a row of police officers. And after 10 minutes, the police officers didn't know what to do, so they just walked away. So the power of the vulva and what it can do. However, there is that control of it, like the voice. The body needs to be controlled. The idea that that there was a creature living inside your uterus. So the word hysteria. Do you know where the word hysteria comes from? Okay. The word hysteria comes from the Greek word hystera, which means uterus. Hysteria means the wandering uterus, the wandering womb. So they really believe that a creature lived inside the uterus. And here you can see this amulet up above that the ancient Greek women would have in their pockets with them. And in the inscription, it says, uterus, stay in place. Because they really believed that a creature was there inside them. They also had this very torturous device that they would insert in through the vagina. It was like a claw that you can kind of see an illustration of that they thought controlled it. They would put a bad smell at the base of the vulva and a good smell at the mouth so that the creature could move out of the body. I was very much interested, of course, in how this is traced in Western society. So I was looking at the different examples of how this kind of moved through the controlling of it. So you see this bridal mold, which was basically a torture device. It was in the 1600s, 1700s in Scotland and England, where if a woman spoke up, if a woman, quote unquote, gossiped, they would put this torture device on her. So you can kind of see it there. It'd be this, like a claw that kind of would stick the tongue down into the mouth, which would render speech impossible. And then it was this cage around the head. And sometimes on that cage, they would make this, it was made out of iron, and they would make kind of cartoonish characters. It would have bells. So it was also in a way to how to humiliate the woman. And it was later used in the United States on enslaved people. So you see this kind of way of another way of silencing the body. Of course, you see in the upper right corner, you have Pandora holding the box, right? This idea of when you open up the box, it's going to put out all of the evils and bad into the world. Also, one example here is with hysteria, this image of hysteria in the 1800s in France, right? So hysteria was a blanket terminology for a lot of different mental illness, but it was also for if a woman just spoke out against the norm or against the policy of the power. And so this idea also, they didn't believe that a woman could have an orgasm. So a lot of these kind of depictions, or the fits as they call it, they would stimulate an orgasm on the woman to have an orgasm, but they thought that of course wasn't an orgasm. They thought she was being possessed by devil. So again, this idea too of that we need to control her body. It's not something that's hers. It's a creature coming in. It's of course the voice. It's animalistic. And we still, an example here above is with Clinton and Trump. And that was like one of Trump's main slogans, right? It's like all his rallies would be lock her up. And this is very much in line with that, this idea of controlling and that kind of the whole body of people his body of people chanting that. And then, of course, I'm thinking of from this research, this archive, what does it then mean what is a contemporary lament today? What do we actually, and who actually needs to be lamenting? And who do we need to hear, and how do we need to hear? So as I mentioned before, from this research phase, I'm really going into the studio where I'm putting it on my own body, and I'm exploring these different physical manifestations of lamenting. What does that look like? So of course, I was going through my own personal process of that, and for many years, I've been working with a somatic therapist, and because everything that I ask my performers to move into, I have already done myself. And of course, this is a very intimate and elaborate process of opening up traumas. So, as I said before, kind of with my practice, the ethics of that, one of the main important things for me is that creating non-hierarchical spaces, creating safe spaces where people can move into that and bring their subjectivity forward. So it's a very sensitive area that needs to constantly be managed and to be cared for. So in that sense, I give a lot of time and space for that to happen. So in a sense, from that, my own studio practice of kind of exploring this and preparing it for the collaborative process, I'm looking at these different categorizations of embodiment and thinking about the different ways that we will move through them, and then seeing their responses of how they move through that. And then there's a lot of reflection on that, a lot of discussion. So because for me, why it's in terms of embodiment, it's so important that the subjectivity is within that, because if I put this forward to you and you watch it, and it's just an application of that, you're never going to feel it. It's never going to touch you. It's never going to trigger you, and the deeper emotions that could be brought to the surface in relationship to what you're seeing. So in that way, by them kind of tapping into those spaces, you can also, and those energies, they're also going to be in exchange of your energies, because that for me is very important, that I don't believe that there is a separation with performance of an audience and a performer. It's very much we are sharing energies within space and time. So of course, then, putting or placing this in the Stedelijk Museum in the monumental staircase, this very white patriarchal space, I'm really thinking about, of course, how the performers are positioned in space, but also how that relates to the audience. So the audience is all around, and in that sense, you really cannot escape it. It's really there. The sound is, I really played with the reverb of the sound. So the sound is really penetrating into the body. And the bass or the subwoof, you kind of feel those vibrations. And it was so much that it was shaking the walls, that the conservationists were having to take the work down off the walls. And one of the conservators came up to me one day and said, yeah, I had to take a Daman painting down, which I really love, because I was like, yeah, taking the man down. What you see here is, again, another collaboration with Elisa Van Jolen and a crochet master named Mika Perlmutter. And Mika crocheted this piece, and in the work I am using a few of Sappho's, or translation of Sappho's poems by Anne Carson. Sappho was an ancient Greek poet, and there's actually only one of her poems in its entirety that exists today, and the rest are fragments. And so what's very beautiful about what Anne Carson did is she shows the absence of what is missing with the brackets. So you see these brackets up there, and then you have sweat. And so these brackets for me very much speak towards the absence of certain narratives. And then of course of how do we fill these brackets and what does that mean? And then the word that is left is poetry in itself, and kind of the space that we fill with meaning within this particular word or set of words that are left. And Elisa is very much looking at this idea of armor and fragility, and playing with the crochet, playing with embossing, and the printing. So another collaboration of this work is I made this publication, and I brought a few today that if you would like to, you can take it home. And this publication, I collaborated with the graphic designers Sandra Kostner and Dong-Young Lee. And this is, of course, some of the images that I showed you before are in them and give you more kind of entrance or leeway into the research. And as I mentioned earlier, I was working with the voice with this work. So, of course, the voice of the dancers is there as well, and two singers. So this is Logan. She's a French singer, performer, and she has a opera background. But I was very much interested in using that, but also in working with her to find her authentic voice in relationship to this history that she, or kind of the knowledge that she had with this opera, but then again, how does she kind of deconstruct that with her own authentic voice and how she wants to lament through that. And then Senon, who is has been singing for many years. She has a very wide range practice, a jazz background, but she's also integrating many different vocal expressions. Main one being her own, being from Turkey and the Black Sea, and she's integrating her own ancestral lamentations in the work and connecting with that. Because in that sense, it was very much an evoking of spirits. I mean, you could feel in this space that we were not alone, that we were bringing forth or summoning our ancestors in a collective way that was very palpable within that. It was very much it's a sensorial work. So I'm also working with a smell artist researcher, Sissel Tollis. And I worked with her in what I placed in the actual Stedelijk Museum in the exhibition space. I left the space, so to speak, empty, with just a slight architectural intervention of extending the doorway. But it was just the space and then the smell of decay. And then we used two molecules from the smell of decay, and they're nano embedded into the fabric. So the dancers were moving around the space, so you get this rush of wind across you, and then you would get the smell of these two molecules of decay. So it was very, of course, smell is a super subjective thing, right? I mean, you'll get an image, you'll get a memory, a different idea of that. And then, of course, in relationship to what is being presented in the space. And I brought the smell with me today. So you can smell a little bit of it. Of course, it's not the actual cloth. It's quite potent, so I have it in a lot of bags here. But this is of course a sample from it. It's not the actual fabric. Ooh. So maybe I can get two people. Yes. Yes. I know, we're asking it with your bodies. So if you can maybe move this around space, everybody can smell it. That'd be great. Do you already start to smell? Maybe. But I can't help to think about how we are in this this anatomical space right now, right, of the body, and that bodies were being opened up here. What were the smells that were here? Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, so this is it's a very strong smell, and of course, this is just a little bit that you got, but you can imagine this is a huge piece of fabric, and then it filled the entire space. And everybody has different reactions to it. Some people it can be really repulsed, others can be very drawn in by it or kind of be indifferent to it. So it's always interesting the subjective responses to that. Um, so yeah, so in that sense, it was a very you know you were being triggered with all of your senses, from the sound to the smell, to the sights, to the feelings, to the emotions, and yes, I mean people kind of in this work, you know, a lot of people are crying. I've had a lot of people at the end of this performance just sob in my arms. And other people kind of are a little bit catatonic. They can't move. It takes them a really long time and they need to separate themselves. They need to be alone. And I've received a lot of different responses from people telling me about their experience and afterwards how it triggered a lot of trauma for them. And then, of course, this is something that I want to start working on is to think about aftercare for performer, for the audience. So the idea of kind of what does that look like? How can a performance not just exist in that time frame, but how can there be also, as I was speaking about, collective spaces? Because I believe collective spaces to heal. Because I believe that performance can be a space for healing. I think it can be a space where we can come together and collectively process things. And so I'm very much interested in then what does an aftercare policy look like, or how can I shape that? And of course, every situation will be different. And of course, everybody processes things differently, right? Some people can be very immediate in their reaction to what they're experiencing, and others, it might take them some time, or it hits you, I don't know, a week later, or 2 weeks later, or however long later. So, in that sense, not kind of speculating on what people need, but kind of, in a sense, it will be a process of thinking about aftercare, that it's not just kind of this one moment, but how can it contribute in different ways. And then I'm going to finish with a trailer of this work. So these speakers don't have a subwoof, so you don't get the yeah to experience that or to feel it. Yes, so that concludes Rock to Jolt, Stagger to Ash. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask about this work. Or anything else that was discussed today?
Are you planning to also tour around this work, or?
Yes, that is the plan, to tour with this work. Yeah.
And if you speak about the tour, is it mainly in institutions?
Not, well, it depends on how you define an institution, but an art institution? Oh, not in a black box, no. I'm more interested in kind of, yeah, the particular space within this. Like, I would love to present this in different spaces, like the parliament or different public spaces that have also certain historical significance or that need kind of shaking of certain walls that need, or walls that need to be shook.
Or any ideas about the care for the audience?
So actually, I'm working with Leon Kreisbeck, who's the curator at KW, and Lara Scherbeck, who's a fellow there. And the three of us are starting to kind of, and also work with KW, other people in KW, to think about the aftercare of the work that will be presented there. So yeah, so I don't want to kind of say it yet because it's not formulated. But thinking, of course, how to do that collectively is a big question I have. And then whether you integrate, I would, but kind of different therapists, but what type of therapists would be there? So yeah, I think in a sense it's quite layered, and of course the first time you do it is going to give a lot of information back. And then, of course, it really, you have to do it with an institution or whoever you're presenting it with. You need to all be on board with it because this is not something I can do as a lone agent in that way. Yeah.
And maybe just in a certain context of space, you do a lot of research. Like, do you also publish this research, or do they come directly with educating you about specifics in your performances, or just translating the performance itself, or do you?
I mean, if you like, I've had a lot of people say, "Oh, it was so great to have this publication," because, and it was funny enough, a doctor that saw the work said, like, "Oh wow, like I could see all the medical references in this," whereas somebody that's not a doctor couldn't necessarily see those things. Or the way he said it, he said he almost read it like a book, the performance, which was interesting. So I think I'm always fascinated with different people and different sets of knowledges that they have, and kind of how they read into the work with their set of knowledge. But of course, like, kind of having this, you can start to see the different references that are embedded in the work, and then you can read this and you can also see its historical significance and understand too this kind of pathway or the roots of certain social political issues that we have today, and where they kind of come from, and how those are embodied.
And they're distributed?
Yeah, so this is distributed. This was in the exhibition space with the smell of decay, and then it's given to everybody after the performance. After the performance, not before. No.
And to elaborate on the research, can you give us an idea from beginning to exhibition, like the time spent or something?
Yeah, that varies because, of course, this was a different circumstance because being nominated for the Prix de Rome, I basically only had 6 months to make this, which is for me extremely tight. I mean, I ultimately created 3 works: I created performance, this publication, and the exhibition space. So I had to, in a way, there was a point where I was so overwhelmed by, I mean, it's just, I could write a PhD on this. It's so much information that I had to cap it at a certain point. So I was doing a residency, or I was doing a residency at Wheels when the pandemic hit, had to go back, and then eventually went back to Wheels, which was so, instrumental in my research in terms of giving me the space and time for reflection, and kind of, I could go deep into it. So I was there for a couple months, and then I was in Athens researching. And so then after I had like those kind of 3.5 months of like pure kind of investigating research, which is quite short. But of course, this isn't just starting at that period. This is many years, it's also, you can find a lot of different links in my previous works. Like Anthology of Anger. I mean, you can see it in a lot of other things or references in that. So it's not like starting completely new. So for me, my research is always building on all of the years. And then, of course, then there's the studio practice and then the collaborative process. So 6 months is like super tight.
If we still watch this beer, we have 6 months.
Yes,
Possible.
it's possible.
I had a question about your performance in the British Museum. How did you manage to perform it there? Was it first your work and then you asked the institute, or the institute asked you to do this performance, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had this research, I wanted to do it, and then I was accepted into Delphina Foundation in London, and then I'm not sure how, but like, I think Block Universe was looking, or they were looking for basically scouting or doing the curatorial work of finding, and then they saw my research, and then they were like, they proposed to do it in the British Museum. So they organized all of the kind of, yeah, the curation of that. And then, of course, it was that and the Rijksmuseum were very tricky. And after that experience, I was like, there's certain things that I will not do anymore. Because with a scale of that museum, you have to be out at a certain time. So the time frame of actually being able to be in there and make it, that process was also very tight. It was luckily the actual process with the team that I had was a beautiful process, and you can feel that in the work. But the institutional pressure and kind of confinements and limitations was something that I was battling with, because I only had 2 hours in the space to block it and get it all in there, and then 2 hours to then shoot it the next day. So it wasn't so much time. And then, of course, you have, it's like you're having to think of every single detail. And, you say you want, okay, for example, do not tell the audience where to go, how to move. But then, of course, they come into the space and they grab the singer's microphone and telling people how to stand in space. So there's so much, there's certain things that I learned a lot from that experience, but there's a lot of stuff too that kind of is out of your control. So you kind of learn too how to work with those limitations. But for example, I have to be in a museum for a certain amount of time and hours. Otherwise, it's too stressful for everybody. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I was thinking that because it really is a critique on the space, the institute, like how was that to do that there, difficulties with the space or the institute itself.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, it was like, as I said before, kind of limitations of how you can use the space, how much time you have. And that's, yeah, I mean, in terms of the critique, it's kind of what I said earlier, that some of it, I think, kind of went, or they weren't really interested. It was kind of like more of they're thinking about performance as a spectacle in their space, and that it's going to kind of attract people. But what I liked about this experience was, of course, you had some people that were kind of, they waited their whole life to see the Parthenon Gallery, and they go in there and they're like, what the hell is this? Why is there a performance in this space? Or people that were kind of like defiant, kind of like still keeping their headphones on, be like, I'm gonna listen to this headset, I'm gonna watch this. So you had a nice kind of, but then they kind of broke, And I really like that when you have the people that kind of just by chance step into it and how they can encounter it versus the theater or let's say kind of more of a classical or contemporary space where people just go to see that. So I like that it kind of you have different types of audience.
Do you ever work with non-dancers?
Yes, yes. In other works of mine, I work with a combination of professional dancers and non-performers. Yeah. And that's a whole other kind of conversation, but how kind of working with a certain concept and relationship to that and different embodiments.
Yeah, how do you select your people for your team?
What's that?
How do you select people for your team?
It's a very elaborate, long process where, it has to be someone that takes space and gives space. Somebody that has a lot of empathy for others, they can work with others, and that, of course, has a connection with this concept, with the material. Because if you don't have a connection with that, it'll never work. So I don't do auditions. If I do anything, it'll be a workshop, but I want to give something to the people that are in the workshop. And then I see kind of how people are working together. And if I see that they would fit, then I would invite them. But most of the time, I kind of have a library, or I'm kind of always researching different dancers or performers. But I'm very kind of like, it's also an intuitive practice of kind of seeing and like seeing a certain energy and just kind of knowing how that would work and what they could bring.
Do you sometimes participate yourself?
Yes, I sometimes perform in my works. If it's more collective works, no, I don't, because it's a really certain methodology that I use, and it needs somebody to hold that space. But yeah, I mean, I started off performing Allegory of the Painted Woman myself, and I think maybe in like 20 years I'll do it again, or 15 years, I don't know. But yeah, and in a couple other works I've performed them. Yeah.
And if I'm right, you work with female and non-binary people only?
Women.
Women,
Yeah. Women and non-binary individuals. Yeah.
Was there a moment you decided to go different, or has it always been like this?
I've always worked with women and gender fluid people. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. Yes.
During the creation, how do you relate to the performers? Do you also ask like them to contribute to your idea, or do you come to the creation already with like a very clear idea in your mind and the performers would just perform in a sense?
No, I never do that. I never do that latter part. No. It's what I was saying before that it's so, for example, like every work is different in how I structure it. Take Allegory of a Painted Woman. That's a very set choreography and a set sound score, but the way that it is embodied is a very personal one. So it's a lot of kind of reflecting in how they experience it, and then we think about how they feel each gesture. So there's a lot of kind of like very detailed research and investigation into each posture. Take, for example, Rock to Joel Staggered Ash. This, of course, is because it's also looking collectively and subjectively into the notion of mourning, but mourning on many levels, right? So how the body actually wants to respond, and that's an important thing for me to mention. Is lamenting is what is lamenting? Lamenting is expressing, bringing what's inside out, uncontrolled, uncensored. It's just right? It's not scripted because we are all like, you're scripted today, right? You like all are sitting in these seats. You could have decided, I want to like, I don't know, be down here or I want to lay across here, right? You could decide, but we all scripted in how we kind of behave, but we also do that. We're also scripted in our emotions about how we can, because our gender, our race, our socioeconomics, our culture, our gender, right? All of those things and the intersection of those things determine how we can or cannot express our emotions. And so I'm interested in looking at how authentically, right, and how you can just bring that out without that external or conditioned way of responding and emoting. And so if I was to do a script on somebody's body, that would defeat the whole entire purpose of it, right? So it has to be a very personal investigation. And that's what I was saying before. It was a very intimate process where a lot of traumas of the performers were triggered. And we, of course, address those traumas and address kind of the experience that they were going through. And then, of course, in terms of embodiment of the body, it's also kind of looking at like gestures or postures, reoccurring things that happen. And then, of course, how does this relate to a scripted body? So how do you kind of break that script and in a sense kind of investigating or researching, doing body research, movement research on how that is done. So in that way, yes, there's always a contributional level. In the end, I am shaping it, I am editing it, but we're all doing kind of, in a sense, I'm asking them to kind of respond to a given task. And then from that, we see how that is, what was kind of the affect of that. And what is that affect? And then what is the embodiment of that affect? So it's quite, I mean, I'm summarizing it a little bit here. It's a little more complex and layered.
Yeah, in addition to her question, I think I was, because you said before, what the performers go through, you also go through yourself, especially with this morning. I was wondering, I mean, I don't go into it, but yeah, how that works for you, and if you share it with them, or if it's like a personal thing, afterwards you go with them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily go into like what a specific trauma I had, but it's more about also kind of, kind of not going into the details of that, but going into the actual somatics of what happened, because that's more interesting. And it's also, I'm also holding space for everybody. So if I put that on top, if I'm not going to go into the specifics of my traumas, because it's not applicable at that moment in time. But there'll be moments too where it's like, there were moments in this process that really, I was, it would trigger me and I'd start sobbing. Then that would happen to, all of us in a way. And then, there's a collective, acknowledgement of that after or discussing it. So it was very, for me, this process with them, of course, it was a healing process for myself, but it was a collective healing process. And for me, this was a reminder of the power of collective healing. And how important that is, and the strong affect that can have on all of us. Because it was also, in a sense, when I was watching or witnessing a performer going through somatically through something, it was something in a way that I could relate to. And then in that embodiment of kind of walking, moving through that and then discussing it, reflecting it, and using it later, that's also what you will feel as an audience member. And so it kind of is this ripple effect, right? That, the process of what collectively we do and heal, emote, that energy doesn't stay in one space. And that's where it takes, kind of the way I constructed it as well, and with them and their willingness of how they keep with every performance, it's not about kind of, okay, I'm gonna go through this. They're really going through it each time and that there's always these elements of researching. So it's not like, okay, here I am and I'm gonna move this cup and I'm gonna put it to my mouth, right? It's really kind of it's actually in the doing. And that's what I'm interested in is the actual embodiment and somatics and subjectivity, energy within that, and how that then translates within a collective experience.
Alright, I think we have to be here for kicked out by the security. But not
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your time.